freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it on to our children in the bloodstream. The only way they can inherit the freedom we have known is if we fight for it, protect it, defend it, and then hand it to them with the well-taught lessons of how they in their lifetime must do the same. And if you and I don't do this, then you and I may well spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it once was like in America when men were free.
Welcome back, everyone, to Patriot Coalition Live. I'm Matthew Nugent.
And I'm Jason Morochek.
The purpose of Patriot Coalition Live is to educate our audience about the U.S. Constitution, the proper role of the government, the importance of America's Judeo-Christian heritage, and how to defend against threats to our republic. We created this podcast primarily for members of the military, veterans, first responders, and other patriots who support them in their noble professions. Today, we're thrilled to bring you episode 3, which is about threats to the U.S. Constitution. We're going to speak in the context of threats to our Constitution. This is not going to talk about liberal, conservative, or libertarian ideologies per se, or any political party. We're going to do our very best to speak in the context of principles and clearly defined, right and wrong. Okay, our goal, as best we can, is to be principle over party. Does that make sense? Okay, all right. Just like episode 2, this will be an overview. On other episodes, this will probably be a 4 or 5 part episode. Okay? All right? Y'all ready? Let's do this.
Sounds good.
Okay. All right. Okay, first, U.S. threat intersectionality. Okay? If you were to put on a piece of paper all the threats to the United States from every source, okay, internally, externally, whether it's a person, a government, a country, what have you, and put them all on the same page. Their commonality where they intersect is they're a threat to the United States. That's why we call it threat intersectionality, okay? So at best, a person or an entity is undermining the Constitution unintentionally. It's very common throughout history, actually, for a person with good intentions or who is following their leader, whether it's a government, whether it's in a business, with good intentions. When those good intentions are co-opted, and good intentions can be used for malicious, causes. At worst, it's a deliberate attack against the United States and the Constitution. Okay, now, the approach we're going to take is who, what leads to the threat, and how they are harming or intend to harm the United States and the Constitution. Okay, external threats. First, we're going to start off with China. I'll preface it with this. Okay, China, as you know, is a communist country. The CCP, Chinese, a Chinese Communist Party is the main party there. There's only one, and China killed 70 million of its own people, primarily Mao Zedong, who founded the People's Republic of China. 70 million of their own people. Mind you, it was in the pursuit of communist utopia. I'll say that again. They killed 70 million people, mostly their own people, in the pursuit of communist utopia. Yeah, it seems like an oxymoron, but the fact is that the number one tool of the Chinese, but of communist and authoritarian ideologies is lies. It's a fact, folks. You can study it. We'll bring it to you, but you can feel confident in that statement as fact, okay? Now, they do tell the truth sometimes, but there will be lies, okay? So also, they used forced and slave labor. Over 1 million Chinese citizens, I don't even know if they're called citizens, but they're living in China. They're the Uyghur Muslims. It's not a direct threat to the United States, but it is absolutely a humanitarian catastrophe. However, what the Chinese are doing, what the Chinese are doing is devaluating their own currency. So the rest of the world thinks, oh, great. Primarily, westernized, developed nations like the United States and England and France and Germany, we're getting great deals on all of our goods from China. Well, guess what? If you got a slave labor to pull from in the tune of millions, okay, what is typically in business, it's 1/3 the cost of labor, 1/3 the cost of the product, and 1/3 to manage and to put away money for for future endeavors, things like that. Well, if about 1/3 of the cost of the product is slave labor, guess what? You can devalue your currency and still the CCP, the country, the nation is going to be very prosperous. However, what happens is developed nations like the United States, our wealth, we're thinking we're getting a great deal, but over time, over the years and decades, it gets shifted to the Communist Party, in this case, China, a communist nation. And so we are indirectly empowering an authoritarian government, communist China.
So Matt,
So,
sounds like what
yeah.
you're saying is that when China can use slave labor and they can manufacture a product basically for free, it allows
Mhm.
them to set the price really low for American consumers to just buy those products, and then our dollars are then being
Mhm.
transferred over to China, and so they're essentially not really competing on a level playing field. So it's an easy way for a authoritarian government to extract wealth from other nations.
That's right. You may have heard that as the trade deficit. And that in that case, when the free market is not a fair market, that's when tariffs can be helpful to even the playing field. Next external threat, Iran and extreme Islam. We'll talk about that a little bit later in this episode. Russia. Now, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, but communism didn't fall. Communism, unfortunately, we mentioned China, is alive and unfortunately well. Okay, so the threats I said Soviets, the Russians pose there is authoritarian ideology in the DNA of the Russian people. Okay, we can go into that further, but it's still there. And there's a nationalist desire. It's every country's nationalist desire to expand and grow and be strong. Well, Russia still has the desire to return to their former glory. It may or may not be in the previous form as the USSR, Soviet Union, but that desire is still there, which is a potential threat to us. Next is global organizations. Can you talk
I
about
was
this,
just going to
Jason?
say, we don't want to forget, if we're still talking about external threats, global organizations are an external threat, right? So you have organizations like the United Nations who
Mhm.
are essentially attempting to subvert the authority of their member nations. Now, I'm not so concerned about the other nations, but for America, we are founded on a nation of laws, and our rights are granted from God. They're
Mhm.
unalienable.
Mhm.
And so when
Mhm.
you have an outside organization like the UN, who tries to get their member countries to sign treaties that would limit for example, one example is to limit the availability of firearms for their people, that's a no-go. That's a no-go in America. So those threats exist, and that's one of the ones that we can attribute to the United Nations. So we would consider them an external threat as well.
Yeah. So this is for those of you who've never heard that before. There have been countries basically trying to usurp our Second Amendment right, and this obviously needs more development from us. We're definitely going to talk about that on another episode. So in terms of internal threats, let me preface it with this. It is very difficult to beat the United States in a head-on war. It's just very difficult. We'll go into that in another episode in more detail, but there are ways to beat the United States through through its culture, and it's been going on for decades. And I would say that Soviet Russia or the Soviet Union and their communists really got the ball rolling, and it's still rolling in the United States. Here we go. Now, the media, at best, the media is being used by our enemies unintentionally. And it's being used to help our enemies. At worst, media is colluding with those who wish to bring harm to America. We can develop this on another episode, but I think pretty much anybody who's watching or listening to this podcast knows that the media tends to be left-leaning, and not just some of the media, most of the media. Our U.S. education system. There's a great book called The Naked Communist by Skousen. Used to work for the FBI, Skousen, Naked Communist, and he writes with tremendous factual evidence that the number one secret weapon of communism is the United States education system. I'll say that again. the number one secret weapon of communism is the United States education system. Now, does that mean there are no good people or there are no good teachers in the U.S. education system? Absolutely not. Okay, it's not the people; it's the leadership and the message. Now, how the strings got pulled, we'll get into that too. But understand this: that that the education system is kind of
It's been
has become
co-opted, right?
it's
Yeah.
been co-opted. It's an institution of indoctrination for sowing division and anti-American rhetoric. So moving on to the next internal threat is Hollywood and movie theater chains. And this is from Matt Pressburg of TheWrap.com. He did a really good job putting this together. I want to give him credit. AMC Theaters, okay? Carmike Cinemas, owned by China, okay? If you've ever seen a movie in there, guess what? It's now owned by China. Another one, Legendary Studios. Ever seen any of the Jurassic Park movies? Owned by China. How about Dick Clark Productions, Golden Globes, American Music Awards, and the New Year's Rockin' Eve? Anything on that show is going to be approved or censored by a Chinese political party member. How about Cirque du Soleil? That's right. I know it comes from France, but it's a great production, and it's a way for China, again, to influence our society. The largest single share of Warner Brothers is owned by China. Harry Potter, Aquaman, the Batman franchise, and many other businesses. For example, here are a couple movies that, unless you're paying attention, you're not going to know this. The movie Gravity with Sandra Bullock. What country saved the day? China. They had a rocket ship, basically a capsule, that she was able to, spoiler alert,
Yeah.
that she was able to get back safely to Earth and get back in gravity again. How about The Martian with Matt Damon? Again, what country was the savior? China. They're the equivalent of the Chinese NASA with their rockets. So what does that do to our attitude? It softens our attitude towards communism. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, what's wrong with China? I just told you, they killed 70 million of their own people in the pursuit of the communist idea of perfection.
If they would be willing to kill 70 million of their own people, they probably wouldn't blink at what it would take to dominate or infiltrate another country. So it's interesting you mentioned, the movies. So this is, sometimes I get frustrated watching some of these movies because I say, because I guess my awareness level for things like socialist ideologies, and I can see a little bit of, these sort of ideologies throughout the movies. So you're telling me basically, there you go, communist creep. When I see that little pockets of that, or maybe they'll make a little, political statement in the movie that's kind of veiled as part of the plot. Now that makes sense, now that you brought that to our attention.
Yeah, and the movies are very entertaining. I mean, we'll get into that later. Yeah. Here's another internal threat. Big tech. Squarespace, Google, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter are being used either willingly or unwillingly, but to help our enemies, to harm the U.S. via one-sided censorship and absolute message banning. And let's see here. And I'll use an example from Dan Bongino. Love you, man. Praying for you, buddy. Now, here's the thing, okay? In a free market society, those businesses, they own, based on the laws now, they own the forum where most American communication takes place. Social media, Google, Facebook, YouTube, it all takes place there pretty much, okay? Now, imagine this. There's a town square 150 years ago, okay? It's a big town square. And the only place where people really get information is on the town square. Well, that town square in that little town is owned by Google and Facebook and Squarespace, but it's for all the town squares in all of the United States. So in order for us to, have our own town square so we can speak freely, it would take literally billions of dollars and a lot of time. So between now and then, guess what? Our speech is censored. Our speech is blocked. Okay. More recently, and most notably in August of 2020, during the COVID pandemic, if you're watching this 5-10 years from now, This is an example, okay? There are about a dozen doctors who got in front of the Supreme Court in their coats. It was basically a press conference on the steps of the Supreme Court. They were introduced to the media by a United States congressman, okay? And their message was this. The country was closed due to COVID, these lockdowns. It's just what we thought we had to do, pretty much unanimously bipartisan. Now, the levels of lockdowns we varied, but basically the country agreed we need to put everything on pause. Now, after a couple months of doing that, these doctors came and this is what they said. We think we found, in fact, we're very confident we found a highly effective treatment for COVID. It was HCQ, zinc, and Zithromax. Within 2 hours, tens of millions of hits and views. After that 2 hours, the big media, big tech, cut it. It was no longer available. And Squarespace, which was the host for the website of the web address, frontlinedoctors.com, took ownership of the URL address, would not let the doctors get it. So they had to create a new one. Now, we can presume why they were doing this. Now, we don't know all the answers. It's difficult to measure intent, but we know what they did was wrong. And that hurt America. It denied information to people so that they could, survive and get through this pandemic. And these people that cut the information, it's really about, guys, it's about a half a dozen people in the United States have this power. They have too much power. So we, as a free market, representative patriots, representative government patriots, or constitutional government patriots, we can do something about it. We'll talk about that later. But the fact is, they were not physicians, none of them, but they made a decision to keep information from us, and that's evil. Okay, so obviously, I'm very passionate about that. That's one of the things that got me to join with Jason Rochek here and bring this to you. Okay, ideological groups, Antifa or Antifa, that's self-avowed Marxist, which is clearly an anti-American group. Communist Party USA, folks, there is a Communist Party in the USA. The website is cpusa.com. Seriously. And they openly promote transforming the United States into a communist party. Mind you, over the last 100 years, from 1900 to 1999, the single most deadly ideology was communism. Why people run to it, I don't know. But those are facts. Okay, next. What leads to threats? Whether it's this speaks to intentions. Now, intention to do harm. Iran. There's Iran, Antifa. I mentioned that. Marxist organizations. I mentioned that. China. I mentioned China and communist creep. It's a slow shift of our culture to towards sympathy towards communism and communist countries. Now, I'll speak to Iran a little bit. I'll tell you something that someone told me, and I didn't believe it. Even when I saw it, it was like it rocked my paradigm. Iran has what I call a day of hate. It's a holiday of hate, if you will. Okay, and the whole country, literally the whole country, takes a day off. Hundreds of thousands of people flock to Tehran. It's basically the capital, and they chant "Death to the West, death to Israel, death to America," and they say "Death to Satan," which for them that's Israel. I think it's Israel or England. Death to the great Satan, which we know for sure is America. And that's what they do all day. Is for the whole day they say death to America.
I'll tell you what, Matt, if someone is saying death to America and that is their national creed, or that's what they're chanting, I think we ought to take them seriously. So that certainly qualifies in my mind as a intentional somebody who intends to harm us, right? There's no question about the subtlety there. They're basically saying it.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Okay. Now, you folks who are in the military, you joined up to serve your country. These are the threats that we face. You veterans, you've seen it before. Some of you veterans, a lot of you have been in straight up combat. Now, we're fighting a different type of war. Okay, so you need to be educated. That's why we're very fortunate to be here to bring it to you. That's what we're striving for every day. We thank you for your support. PatriotCoalitionLive.com. Go to PatriotCoalitionLive.com. Please subscribe, share it with your friends, watch these. We appreciate your support. Okay, so Jason, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, so, I mean, you've done a great introduction. We talked about, what the threats are. We initially, you started talking about
Mm-hmm.
the who is the threat, right? The external,
Mm-hmm.
and that's the nations and the organizations, and then the internal threats, the ideologies and
Mm-hmm.
the institutions. And then, so you just started talking a little bit about now, what is it that leads to the threats? What is kind of their motive? And we started talking about the intentional the threats. People and organizations, whoever it is, they actually are intending to subvert or undermine our constitutional republic. So those are the ones that are intentional about it. But there's also a couple other categories that we have to talk about, right? Not everyone is you mentioned it earlier. Even though they may have good intentions, they might be
Mm-hmm.
still harming America, and they're a threat still, whether they know it or not. So these other two categories of what causes someone to threaten America, the second one is ignorance, right? So. And we're not using this as a pejorative, right? Ignorance can be
That's right.
used as a pejorative, but we're just saying there is a lack of knowledge in people, institutions, communally even, about what our constitutional republic is, the proper role of government, what the
Mm-hmm.
liberties the Constitution defines. And if you don't know what is in the Constitution, it's very difficult to defend it, right? So, and there's two main categories, and
Mm-hmm.
for years of the Patriot Coalition, we said there's basically two groups that matter. There's we the people and the people that we elect, right? Those two groups. Well, if there's a preponderance of ignorance in those two, it's a problem.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In our elected officials, like if they don't know what's in the Constitution, well, first of all, I don't know how they support and defend it if they don't know what's in it. But if they're not, that can lead to things like them.
That was a truth bomb. Truth bomb.
Yeah, should I say that? Yeah, should I say that again?
Please.
How can you defend how can you take an oath to support and defend something that you don't know what's in it, right?
That's right.
But it happens. It happens all the time.
Mm-hmm.
We've got
Mm-hmm.
elected officials who don't understand the proper role of government and what their role is. So they're creating laws that are spending our money that they're not authorized to do. They are, creating whole departments and bureaucracies that they're not authorized to do, and all of those are a threat to our liberty. So ignorance in elected officials can be pretty dangerous, but more importantly is the ignorance in we the people. And again, not pejoratively, but if they don't know what's in the Constitution, it's up to us, one, to not elect them. But if they are in power, it's up to us to educate them. But again, that begs the question, how are we to hold them accountable or even to educate our elected officials on what they are supposed to do if we don't know what's in it, right? So it's important for us to understand what's in it. And so those are some of the threats come through ignorance, just people don't know. And so if they don't know, there's also this category where they may align themselves with something, a feel-good group or ideology. That sounds great. I want to, help the poor. Well, if you're helping the poor by taking money from the rich, that's taking somebody's hard-earned property.
That's right.
And if it's done unjustly, so these people who don't understand, they come on both sides of the aisle, as we say. So anyway, so you talked about the intentional.
Can I say something there?
Yeah.
You just described how I used to be.
Oh,
I want to do something good.
Were.
It's the American way to be a server, I think, and to have good intentions. But we need to educate ourselves.
No, at some point, all of us. I mean, I was there as well. I mean, even I took that same oath, and yes, I knew what the Constitution did. I knew its intent was, and I knew what I was supposed to do. But I certainly didn't know the whys and wherefores and what exactly it was doing. Right. So I had to educate myself. So yeah, if you're out there and you're thinking, well, I don't really know what's in it, then that's okay. And we'll talk about that later.
Come on along with us, folks.
Yeah, we're gonna get deep into the Constitution and the principles of liberty. So
and it's gonna be fun.
Yeah, stand by. And then so the third, so there's intentional people who are intentional about it. There's people who are ignorant of it, and then there's those who are just plain apathetic. And again, this comes in the two subcategories: we the people and the people we elect. We the people, they don't go vote, they don't hold their elected officials accountable, and so the elected officials, they're not really putting much heat on me, so I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing. I don't really need to get involved and honor my
That's
oath
right.
because everyone, it's the status quo. Everyone just kind of accepts the status quo. That's why you have so few people, not why, but that is a problem when so few people are just apathetic about defending our liberties. So,
You bet.
so now we've talked, who is the threat? We've talked about, what form that threat comes in and causes that threat. So we need to talk about with the mechanism, how is the actual harm coming to the Constitution? So this can come in three different ways too, right? So the first is structurally, and by structurally I mean, there may be a bill that is passed that's unconstitutional, that is a threat to liberty. It may be an amendment to the Constitution that it tries to change, our Republican form of government, or there may be some sort of threat to the makeup of our electoral system, right? And so I'm going to just briefly talk about a few of those. In our Constitution, we'll talk a lot about this. In Article 1, Section 8, it specifically tells us the things that our government is allowed to do and those things it is not allowed to do. So when a legislator or legislature passes an unconstitutional enactment, they're doing that in contravention to the Constitution, right? They're not supposed to be doing that. And so what happens is soon we have all of these unconstitutional enactments that everyone just assumes because it passed the House and because the president signed it, that it's law. Well, that's not the case. No, it's not the case. And when no one says anything, and again, going back to holding our elected officials accountable, if we're not doing that, then everyone just sort of, again, the status quo becomes whatever that unconstitutional bill is. So we see this in the form of, again, gun legislation. We see this in the form of healthcare legislation, all sorts of unconstitutional spending that goes on. The enemies to liberty can also use this to pack what we call pack the courts, right? They can use law because the Constitution gives the Congress authority to choose the number of Supreme Court justices. Well, they can use that.
Can I add something to that?
Yeah.
So just because someone gets enough people who are legislators to agree to something doesn't make it right. It has to apply to the Constitution. And if one of you ever become a legislature and our U.S. Constitution prevents you from doing something, it's probably because it's wrong.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's a tip.
Yeah, you'll hear us use the phrase, in pursuance of the Constitution, meaning that it conforms with it. So, as I mentioned, you can also, the enemies to liberty can try to amend the Constitution to make it less of a republic. And frankly, this is what happens with the 17th Amendment when they removed the state the U.S. senators from being elected by their state legislatures. That was a huge move in the wrong direction. It moved us, from liberty towards authoritarian rule or tyranny, and we'll get into the reasons of why that's not a good idea. So another example of amending the Constitution is if you go and you try to amend the Constitution through, let's say, an Article 5 convention, who's going to get their hands on the Second Amendment? Probably none of us want to do that, right? We don't want our Second Amendment touched. Right now it's pretty strong. There are other ways to do this. You can undermine the Electoral College by
bad news.
Yeah,
that's bad news right there.
Right now, there's a movement underway to try to get enough states that will choose their presidents based on the popular vote rather than of the country rather than the popular vote in their state. So that is bad news because then you get basically a handful of large cities across the country who are deciding all presidential elections.
Yes.
And then the worst possible way structurally to threaten our Constitution would be through revolution or overthrow or just outright violence. And this can come in many forms, but anytime that somebody is using violence in order to act in opposition to government righteous government authority, right? That's bad news. And so you have a lot of anarchists and a lot of Marxist organizations who are doing things like this, and whether they know it or not, or if they have the right reasons or not, we don't know, but it's happening. So that's a huge threat. Okay, so
There you go.
that's one mechanism by which somebody can threaten our Constitution, is just structurally. So the second one is through government overreach, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is when any branch of government exceeds their authority that is granted to them in the Constitution. So this could be executive orders from the executive
Mm-hmm.
branch. It could be a president issuing executive order that is beyond his authority, that is essentially creating law, which is reserved solely for the legislature. It could take the place of a Congress, as we just talked about, exceeding their authority by passing a bill that is repugnant to the Constitution, that it doesn't conform with it. It could be the judicial branch. Obviously, we hear about judicial tyranny, judicial overreach, judicial
Mm-hmm.
activism.
Mm-hmm.
Anytime a court issues what they call an order that is not in compliance with the Constitution or is beyond the scope of,
Mm-hmm.
of the laws that have been passed, that's government overreach. You know, here's some examples, right? You talked about the whole China virus situation
Yes.
earlier. You know, the COVID-19. When you have governors who are issuing executive orders that 6 or more people cannot peaceably assemble in the same place unless they have a mask or not at all.
Yeah.
That's in direct violation of our First Amendment. They are not authorized to do that. So these are complete overreaches by government authorities. Okay, so yeah, go.
Yeah. Can I add something to that?
Yeah.
So in the application of law, what makes it, one measure of what makes it constitutional or not is if it's evenly applied. For example, throughout the state of California, literally right now, today, churches can't assemble with more than, I think it's 6. They can't sing. You can't have people at your house for church unless they live there. All this time, marijuana dispensaries are open. Casinos are open. People can assemble outside in the thousands if they're protesting for a cause that the governor promotes. That's tyranny, folks. It's going through the courts right now. Yeah. Yes, it feels like the Twilight Zone. Was it 1984?
It is.
So hence we're here to talk with you. Upside Down World, for those of you who are, what's the name of that, Stranger Things, Upside Down World?
Oh, I've never seen it. That was just something I pulled out.
It's Upside Down World. That's our culture now. That show's going to be around a while. But yeah, you were saying.
But you make a great point. I mean, that's on 2 different levels. One, it's unconstitutional because it's in violation of the the Assemble Clause of the First Amendment. But it's also a violation of the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause, right? You know, the laws have to be faithfully executed across the board. So anyway, so now we've talked in how something is a threat in terms of the mechanism. We've talked about structurally, we've talked about overreach. The last one is probably the worst, and that is faithlessness, or faithless politicians. These are the ones who have taken an oath, and it kind of goes hand in hand with the apathy, right? These are the elected officials who have taken an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And then they get into office and they're just like, kind of whatever works. I'm in power. I've got all this influence. I can kind of set myself up for life. And so I'm not really going to worry about what my oath said that I'm supposed to support and defend. I'm just going to kind of ride this gravy train, right? So then they whether it's in Congress, whether it's the executive branch, if you're now going to allow lawless behavior, such as, we'll say immigration anarchy, or, the whole illegal alien invasion, and let illegal aliens come to this country without prosecuting those laws, you're allowing them to violate Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution, that provides us a guarantee against invasion. When you are allowing rioters in the streets and political organizations or Marxist organizations just tear up your city,
allowing them, as in like for an extended period of time,
and not executing the laws, you're essentially allowing them to usurp the authority of the government, which, we're all guaranteed, every one of us, in the same Article 4, Section 4, a Republican form of government, which means that it has to be by the laws. And if those aren't enforced, it's not a Republican form of government. So you have faithless politicians who are just allowing this rampant behavior and lawless behavior. You have You talk about immigration again. If you allow, and a lot of this is deliberate, as we talked about before, intentional, and some of it's through ignorance. But when you allow a complete invasion of people to come across into our country who are not supposed to be here, it allows them to undermine our wages and therefore drive down costs. We'll do at least an episode probably on the illegal alien invasion.
Yes,
The bottom line is it weakens our economy, and you can't have that open border and then also have a welfare state where then they can come here and drain U.S. taxpayers of their hard-earned money as well. So it weakens the economy. So and it makes it very easy because they come at the bottom of the socioeconomic scale. It makes them very susceptible to, again, through ignorance, they're brand new to our country, to what is supposed to happen in this country. So it's kind of like an evil cycle where they're bringing in more people who are going to side with a anti-constitutional viewpoint. So, and so that's it kind of for the mechanisms. So we've brought you this episode, which is intended to kind of make you aware of the threats, right? In order to be a patriot, in order to effectively support and defend the Constitution, of course, you have to know the Constitution, but you also have to know the threats that are going to be attacking it from whatever quarter.
That's right.
So we've talked about who the threat is from, whether it's an external or internal force, the external being nations or organizations, and the internal sources being institutions in the United States as well as ideological groups. We've talked about, what leads to the threat. What kind of is that motive? Is it intentional? Is it just through ignorance? Or is it through just apathy? And then we finally talked about how all of these threats can actually harm us, harm our constitutional republic. So that is, structurally, in terms of the way that we're actually physically structured constitutionally or even electorally. We talked about government overreach, when they just exceed their mandates, and then just the faithless politicians who are allowing lawless behavior without any repercussion. So I hope that's been a good episode. I hope it's been a lot of good information. But again, all this stuff we're going to go into in greater detail. This is supposed to be the 30,000 foot view. Right. We're going to dive into each one of these topics. So I hope you'll hang with us. It's going to be a great ride.
Awesome. So as you can see, folks, fellow patriots, we've got a lot stacked up against us, which is the reason why, Jason and I started this. Now, I had a very, very good friend tell me, Matt, you can't make a difference. One person can't make a difference. I said, well, I didn't entirely agree with him, because in some ways he's right, but in some ways he's wrong. If that person is a person of action, if the person's a leader, now some of you may not be comfortable with calling yourself a leader. Call yourself a person of action. That's fine. It took me a while before I could feel comfortable, calling myself a leader. What we're asking you is this: will you affect change? Will you take action? Okay, listening to this podcast is a great start. If it's one of your first podcasts to listen to, please subscribe to our podcast. Listen, please ask your friends to subscribe and podcast. Go to patriotcoalitionlive.com. That's patriotcoalitionlive.com. We appreciate your support, whether it's one time or monthly. It's very helpful. Get involved with local elections. This is a process. Jason and I haven't put an end date, an expiration date on this podcast, because it's a fight. We're going to fight our whole lives. And it's not just for us. It's for our children, for our neighbors and their children. Okay.
Yeah, Matt, and I'll just throw something in here too. You've learned today where the threats are coming from and how you can kind of help spot them, right? So, hopefully if you're listening to this podcast, you now have a grasp. You can kind of at least put things in buckets. Now it's up to you to help other people point them out when you see them, right? Say, what? They may not be intending to do this, but here's what they're allowing to happen through their ignorance or through their apathy. So help your friends and neighbors and loved ones see the same things now that you're seeing.
Yeah, and it takes a while. I mean, it took me years, probably really 10, 15 years, but someone planted the seed a long time ago. And it's like, like Jason was talking about, point the little, dots, and I was able to connect them. And I said, time out. That's it. We're taking action. So now, if this is the start of your journey, you might think, I should have started this years ago. Best time to plant a tree is 30 years ago. Second best time is today. So start today. Also, go to patriotcoalitionlive.com. We would love to hear your feedback. We would love to hear your questions. What would you like us to talk about? And if you give us a good question we talk about, we may even give you a shout out, okay? So with that, thanks again, everybody. We will see you here next time.
Thanks, gang. See you next time.
Bye now.